Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where each week I answer a film-related question submitted by a member of the BMFI community. This week's question: in the recent movie Mank, starring Gary Oldman as screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, the focus is on the period in his life when he wrote the screenplay for Citizen Kane. Through flashbacks to the early 1930s, we get a sense of his conflict with Louis B. Mayer and an interesting storyline about the 1934 race for governor of California. My questions are: how accurate is the portrayal of Mankiewicz during this time period, and what did you think of the film overall? Well, I was very excited to see this movie from the moment I first heard about it for a couple of reasons. One, Mankiewicz is a fascinating figure and, and an extremely intelligent, funny, and you know man with an acerbic wit, and I knew that that would be entertaining to see. I also am a sucker for movies about the history of Hollywood. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I am a huge David Fincher fan. I have seen all of his movies. I have greatly enjoyed and appreciated all of his movies, even his first feature film, Alien 3, which he himself has basically disowned. I even thought that one was good, and I even liked that one. Um, so I was very happy to only recently, unfortunately, have the opportunity to see the movie, but I'm very glad I did, and I thought it was wonderful. I can go a bit more into my thoughts on it more generally, but to answer the part of the question about the historical accuracy of the film or the accuracy of the portrayal of Mankiewicz, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, it would maybe get a C for accuracy of its portrayal. Mankiewicz was an alcoholic. That is ultimately what killed him. He was a gambler to the degree depicted in the film. He did know and spar with Louis B. Mayer and William Randolph Hearst, and he was friends with Marion Davies, and he did assemble a cadre of brilliant writers or writing talent, I guess I should say, in Hollywood through the use in part of telegrams to select friends saying basically, if I recall correctly, there are millions to be made out here and your only competition are idiots. He did send such a telegram at least to Ben Hecht, one of the writers that we are introduced to in the movie. And he was responsible for a significant portion of the screenplay of Citizen Kane. And he was responsible for the elements, many of the elements that are so memorable and influential in the film. And he did write it out at a ranch while recovering from a car accident. And he did have a contentious relationship with Orson Welles. And he did have an assistant who typed up his writings, and he had a housekeeper, and John Houseman, who was Wells' producer, came to see him, and all that stuff is fairly accurate. There are two major areas of significant inaccuracy in the film. One has to do with the 1934 election for governor, where sort of progressive socialist writer Upton Sinclair is running against, certainly much more conservative than him, but conservative Republican Frank Merriam, who would ultimately win the election. The movie seems interested in sort of making that campaign and the issues it represented fit into some sort of ideological or thematic alignment with the view it has of Hearst and the view that it indicates through the writing process for Citizen Kane that Mankiewicz and Wells have of Hearst, which is namely, that sort of the one that the film paints of the Hearst-like figure of Kane, right? The sort of sense of entitlement, no boundaries, the wealth and the power used for his own ends, and so on and so forth. And the issues that are raised by the Sinclair campaign and those who support it in the film would obviously go against that. And anyone who's at all familiar with anything Upton Sinclair's ever written would know that he would have very much been anti-Hearst, to say the least. Now, it makes a sort of neat kind of parallel set of circumstances for those events, that debate, that struggle, that contest in 1934 to inform that Mankiewicz was a witness to, and in some marginal way a party to make that a sort of template for what he's going to write about Hearst in Citizen Kane. But the problem is there's no indication that Mankiewicz was a Sinclair supporter. There was no indication that he was, for example, pro-union. He refused to join the Writers Guild and didn't think much of it. He was, a more conservative, he's probably would today be called center right. He was not a muckraker. He was not a progressive. He was certainly not a socialist. And he did not have anywhere near the passionate engagement for the Sinclair campaign that the film suggests. And in fact, he was probably almost certainly on the side of Merriam, and almost certainly would have voted for Merriam. So that doesn't really track with the movie. One can think of all sorts of reasons why it makes sense to paint things with that brush, both in terms of sort of for the general impression of the Mankiewicz character, and also probably, even though the film was written in the 1990s by Fincher's dad, it was obviously only made in the last year or so, and as such, one can imagine the reasons why there would have been an interest in aligning the protagonist, the hero of the film, more or less, with that the underdog, the guy who stands up for the little guy. That Mankiewicz, the film tries to sort of suggest that Mankiewicz is the little guy, so of course he would side with the little guy. He's the little guy in his battle with Wells. He's the little guy in the disagreements with Hearst. So of course he'd be for the quote unquote little guy in the 1934 gubernatorial election, but there's no evidence to indicate that he was. The other sort of area of inaccuracy in the film has to do with the extent of his contributions to the screenplay for Citizen Kane. This is an area of intense debate. Pauline Kael wrote an article that was turned into a book, sort of basically saying that Wells deserved no credit for the screenplay and Mankiewicz deserved all of it. Then Wells did some interviews with Peter Bogdanovich and cited some sources and provided some drafts and evidence that indicates that he actually deserved the lion's share of the credit. And the truth is probably, as it often is, somewhere in the middle. There's an article by historian Robert Carringer, who that most people seem to agree is probably the most accurate account of things, which is that in essence, Mankiewicz wrote the first draft, and in that first draft, or the early drafts, I should say, and in them there are a lot of important elements that helped make the story and make the film, but that if you look at the different drafts that circulated and other sort of supporting documentation, Wells made not only significant revisions to some of what Mankiewicz wrote, but he also created whole new scenes and whole new elements as well. So it really was a collaboration that is probably approaching a 50-50 collaboration, which is not really what the film shows. I have no doubt that Wells was reluctant to give Mankiewicz screen credit, in part because Mankiewicz, as the film does acknowledge, signed a contract saying he would not need, or he would forego writing credit for anything he did for Wells's production company, but also because Wells had this reputation as this sort of wunderkind, and part of that is that he's this auteur, right? He's the artist behind his films, and so it seems on brand, as they say, that he wouldn't have wanted to share the credit, but he ultimately did, and it certainly seems like it was deserved, though perhaps not as sort of overwhelmingly as deserved as the film suggests. But all that being said, if you don't mind if you don't mind historical inaccuracies and fabrications in your movies about actual people and historical figures, if that's something you can put aside, and if the movie doesn't claim to be factual and doesn't claim to be a documentary, I can usually put it aside. I thought the film was wonderful. I obviously thought it was wonderful for all of the reasons that I said earlier about liking Fincher's work, but I just thought it was a very bold film. I thought it was wonderful the way it used the style and themes of Citizen Kane to tell a story about the one of the creators or the co-creator of Citizen Kane. I thought that the film showed a really great understanding of the filmmaking style and techniques of that time, even though obviously this was shot digitally and with the latest in technology, as Fincher always does. The sort of cigarette burns were added in, which is something that would have been present in any film from any of the period shown within Mank. I found it to be wonderful. I only wish that I could have seen it on a big screen, because that's Fincher makes his movies to be seen that way, despite him having signed a contract with Netflix, which is one of my a great frustration of mine personally. He makes his movies to be seen on the big screen, and this movie the shots were composed, it was lit, and the interesting transitions were really sort of created to be seen under the ideal visual circumstances, at the right scale, with the right lighting in the room, and so on. And the only place to get that is at a theater. So I hope to have the chance to see this movie again one day in a theater. And I think anybody who either likes David Fincher's films or likes movies about unlikable people with sharp wits, or is interested in the history of Hollywood, would find this movie very entertaining and a very easy watch, as they say. So I was glad to have the chance to talk about it, and I appreciate the question. And if you have a film-related question you'd like to hear my thoughts on, please visit the Ask Andrew section within Film Studies Online at brynmarfilm.org. And who knows, next time maybe I'll be answering a question you sent in.